Welcome ISU SSP 14 participants and ISU alumni who are in the audience. Tonight we have a very special talk for you by Dr. Jeff Hoffman, hosted here at HEC Montreal. You may notice that compared to the engineering school that we were in all morning, that this is much more plush. So that is a lesson for whether you want to go into engineering or business, by the way. So I'm pleased to reintroduce to many of you Dr. Jeff Hoffman. You've heard him lecture to you, so I won't keep you for long on an introduction. But I will say that Jeff was fortunate to be an astronaut during what some astronauts refer to as the golden age of the space shuttle. During one time in the space shuttle history, we were flying, up to 7 or 9 times a year. Right, 50 different astronauts a year. And as soon as you finished one mission, you started training for your next mission. So if you read Jeff's biography, you see he flew on STS-51D, STS-35, STS-46, STS-61, and STS-75. That's 5 trips into space. Not bad. And the other interesting thing is he's bookended his career with MIT. So you came out of MIT as a researcher when you were chosen as an astronaut, and following his astronaut career, he returned to MIT as a professor of astronautics. So I'd like you to all please welcome again Dr. Jeff Hoffman.
Thanks. Okay, well, thank you, John. It sounds like the mic is on. You can all hear me in the back, so that's good. I'll just continue that story a little bit. I actually had 3 space flights in 3 calendar years, so they did keep us busy for a while. After my final, what was my final space flight, the 5th one, they were short of astronauts with EVA experience, and we were getting ready to build the International Space Station. So the head of Johnson Space Center at the time offered me a 6th flight, but I was also offered the opportunity to go and live in Paris for 4 years as NASA's diplomatic representative in Europe. So they said, all right, Jeff, you have to choose Paris or space. And of course, my wife heard about that, and we chose Paris. And no regrets. I had 5 good flights and 4 wonderful years in Paris, so everything worked out really nicely. What I'd like to do today is to try to share with you, as well as we can do in words and pictures, what goes into a space flight. And particularly, of course, what it's like for an astronaut. But I don't just want to talk about the astronaut part of the experience, because spaceflight, as you all know, is highly technical, and a critical part of it is preparing your spacecraft before you fly. So, of course, the shuttle is no longer flying, but I don't know how much all of you know about how you get ready, how you make a shuttle ready for a flight. So just very quickly, I want to take you through that, because whether you're flying in the shuttle or a Soyuz or someday in one of the other new spacecraft that are going to be online that you've all heard about, it's absolutely critical that you do this right. You can't cut corners. You don't want to go into a space flight and just sort of have to cross your fingers because you're not sure whether something is going to work or not. I mean, you can cross your fingers anyway and wish for good luck, but that's not enough when it comes to space flight. So let me take you very briefly through what goes on getting the shuttle ready for a flight, and it all happens at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. You're all familiar with the shuttle stack. We have the orbiter, the tank which holds the fuel for the orbiter, the liquid hydrogen and oxygen, and the 2 solid rocket boosters. So let's start with the solid boosters, which were reusable. So after every flight, they would parachute down into the Atlantic Ocean. They were recovered by one of the 2 ships that constituted NASA's Navy. And they come in segments. They were shipped back to Utah where they were built, and in Utah they were cleaned, checked, refilled with propellant, shipped back to Florida, and then taken into the big vehicle assembly building to be stacked. This gives you some idea of the scale. That is a lot of propellant. And one of the things to remember when you think about, what you're doing when you strap yourself on top of all of this propellant, you're sitting on top of about 4.5 million pounds of high explosives. And I'm told that that's roughly the amount of energy that you would have in a small nuclear weapon. What you're trying to do, of course, is release that energy in a controlled fashion. But risk is part of spaceflight, and I will talk about that as we go through the evening. But anyway, it's impressive when they lift those up and they bring them down and stack them. And here they're actually making the seal with those O-rings inside that keep all of the hot exhaust gas in there. And since we're talking about risk, of course, it was a failure in this containment system that led to the Challenger accident, which really, I think, changed the way a lot of people looked at the shuttle. It was sold at the beginning as being as safe. There were people who should have known better, who were telling the public that it was as safe to fly on the space shuttle as it was going to fly on a 747. It was so safe that we could fly a teacher on board, and of course we know the tragic results. But anyway, getting back to the technical aspect, the boosters are assembled and they're stacked up, and then we have this huge external fuel tank which holds the liquid oxygen, the liquid hydrogen, and you all understand, I hope, why the oxygen tank is so much smaller, because oxygen is much denser than hydrogen. Those are then put together and shipped in a large barge. That's done in Louisiana. And then they're shipped on the inland waterway to Florida, where they make their way to the Kennedy Space Center and are brought into the VAB and lifted up and put into place between the two solid boosters. And of course, again, the risk and the tragedies, it's some of the insulation on the outside fell off, punctured the leading edge of the wing of the Columbia, and led to the loss of the Columbia and the crew. So it's a risky business, and we never forget about that, and that's part of being an astronaut, is how you deal with that risk. I'll say a few words about that later. But then we have the orbiter itself, which, after it lands, is taken into the hangar for refurbishment. Of course, again, in the early days when the shuttle was being sold to Congress and the public, it was at least imagined by some people that you could just turn the shuttle around in this artist's conception. They would just have a little crane to take the payloads in and out, and you'd need a few people, and it would take maybe 2 weeks to turn it around. Well, the reality turned out to be a lot more complicated, as we all know. You can hardly see the shuttle inside all of the scaffolding, and there's hundreds of people here in the hangar. The fastest I think we ever turned a shuttle around was about 3 months. You really have to go through every little bit on the shuttle. The shuttle was designed by the same people who designed the Apollo hardware, and that's probably why the shuttle worked as well as it did, because they really knew what they were doing. They knew how to build a spacecraft, but nobody at the time knew what was involved in reusing a spacecraft, which is why it took a lot longer. As an example, it was originally thought that you would leave the main engines in for 10 flights before you'd have to take them out and inspect them. Well, after the first flight, that's where the subsystems engineers for every single system have to get up in front of the flight readiness review and certify that their system is safe to fly. So the main engine people figured, well, we better, just the first flight. We've never reused large rocket engines before. We better take them out and inspect them. And they continued to do that for every single flight. So one of the many reasons why it took a lot longer to service the shuttle. And then there are the fuel cells and all of the internal plumbing, and of course the more than 30,000 thermal protection tiles which stop the shuttle from, underneath it's aluminum, which at a few hundred degrees, that aluminum loses its structural strength. And so it's only those very delicate tiles. And again, nobody imagined how difficult it was going to be to maintain them. But nevertheless, for 133 of the 135 flights, the shuttle worked beautifully. After we finish in the hangar, it's rolled out, taken over to the vehicle assembly building, rolled inside, and now's where it gets really exciting. You hook up the big crane, and of course they test this crane very thoroughly before they lift the shuttle. You don't want to drop a space shuttle or any other thing. But I'll tell you, when you look up and you can see a shuttle hanging 100 meters above your head, it is really impressive. It's lowered down onto the external tank, and here's the forward attach fitting. And of course, these are the explosive bolts where when you've used up all your fuel and you're basically up in orbit, then you blow those explosive bolts and then you fly the shuttle away from it. After my third flight, when I was getting ready for the Hubble mission, I took my parents on a tour, and they were actually just doing this operation when we were up there. And my mother went up to the person and said, "I hope you're doing a good job. My son is going to be on that flight." And he said, "Ma'am, we take good care of our astronauts." So my mother was, I can't say she was happy, but anyway. So out goes the shuttle on the way to the launch pad. It's a couple of kilometers to get out there. Some very pretty, this is one of my favorite shots of the early morning fog, and you can see the launch pad out there and the shuttle. Up the hill, onto the pad, and another one of my favorite pictures we actually had two shuttles on the pads at the time, and a nice rainbow coming in the Atlantic Ocean out there. So that's how we get the spacecraft ready. And then we have the crew. How does the crew get ready? Because, of course, we actually spend, as astronauts, more time training than we do flying. And that's true even for the people who spend 6 months up on the International Space Station. They spend a couple of years getting ready for every flight. So this is most people's conception. These are the photogenic parts of astronaut training. Water survival, jungle survival, how to cook and eat an iguana, and so on and so forth. But actually, and we do those things, but actually that takes up a very minute fraction of the time that you're training for spaceflight. What really happens when you show up as a new astronaut, it's just as intense as ISU, I'll tell you. You get just a stack of training manuals that you have to read. And of course, nowadays with the International Space Station, it's not just the NASA stuff, but all the Russian stuff. And then you have the European Columbus module and the Japanese Kibo module. And I mean, there's just a lot of stuff you have to learn. Then once you've got some basic knowledge of all of this, it's time to actually go into the simulators. This is what we call the physical simulators, where we actually go through some of the activities. For instance, you want to thoroughly rehearse your first day in orbit, because a lot of people are disoriented. There's space motion sickness, which I'll say a few things about later. And you want to get your plans down so that they're almost second nature. So that when you're not feeling so well and you're all confused, you can still do what has to be done. course, we don't have that. This is now in the Museum of Flight in Seattle, and we now have the space station simulators. But similarly, you go through a lot of the physical procedures. And then we also have the electronic simulators. We use nowadays more and more a lot of virtual reality for training. The pilots can still use the motion-based, kind of like a link trainer. For spacewalks, we spend a lot of time underwater. That's the best way that we are able to simulate the weightless environment of space, because if I were standing in a spacesuit here in front of you, I mean, a spacesuit here on Earth would weigh about 140 kilos, so I wouldn't be able to do very much in it. I could barely support its own weight. In fact, we do sometimes take our real spacesuits into a vacuum chamber, both for testing equipment and testing the spacesuit itself. And when they do that, they have to hook up a cable to support the weight of the spacesuit, and it's on little pulleys, so you can move back and forth a little bit. But underwater, the spacesuit is full of air and it wants to float, and so they put lead weights on your chest and your arms and your legs, essentially to make you neutrally buoyant, so you don't sink but you don't float. And then they pressurize it with respect to the surrounding water to create the same kind of stiffness that we have in a real spacesuit. So it's really remarkably similar. On my very first flight, I should say, for every shuttle flight, we had 2 people trained to use a spacesuit, even if they weren't planning to do a spacewalk. And I was one of those 2 people on my first flight. As it turned out, one of the satellites that we launched didn't activate, and so they had us do what was the first unplanned contingency spacewalk in NASA's history to go out and try to fix it. And I remember as I opened the airlock hatch and sort of floated out, and my stomach was down towards the shuttle, and I was sort of moving over towards the toolbox to get the tools I needed for the job, thinking to myself, boy, this really feels like the water. That was great training. And then I turned over, and there was the Earth and the sky, and I thought, oh, you're not in the water tank anymore. I talked about parabolic flights in an earlier lecture. We also practice with our spacesuits in there, just to feel what it's like when you're really weightless inside a spacesuit. And then nowadays, I didn't do this. I actually did volunteer in the early days of the Shuttle Mir program to fly with the Russians, but I think I mentioned before I'm about 5 centimeters too tall to fit in the Soyuz, at least in the previous configuration. But nowadays, as part of your training, you really spend a lot of time on the road. You spend, and all US astronauts, in order to qualify for a flight on the space station, have to pass a fluency test in Russian, and I think vice versa as well. So, and you spend a lot of time in Russia, in Europe, in Japan. It really takes a toll on your personal life. You put a lot of time into doing this, and it's kind of up to you. I did my best to balance that with my family life. We had 2 young sons. They were young at the time, and hopefully I did a good job. None of them turned out to be axe murderers, so I guess. Anyway, getting back to our training. So about a month before the flight, we fly down in our T-38s, and this is one of the really fun parts of astronaut training. I had never done any flying like this. I used to jump out of airplanes, but I never flew them, and I got at least to fly in the back seat, which has full controls, and these are like little sports cars, so this was really neat. But anyway, we fly down to the Cape for a dress rehearsal, a test countdown they call it. So we will actually go through all the procedures that we'll go through on launch day, getting in our launch and entry suits, getting strapped in to the top of the shuttle. Of course, the difference is it's not loaded with fuel at this time. Well, the solids are, but the external tank isn't. And there's hundreds of people crawling all over the launch platform, getting things ready for the launch. We count down to T0 and then declare a launch abort. And at that point, we go through the escape procedures. We get in a little bucket, and this wire up here goes all the way down to the ground. When you get down to the ground, then you have a choice. You can either crawl into an underground bunker, and of course you would do this if there was a suspicion that there was going to be a fire or an explosion on the launch pad, and you can stay in the bunker until things are safe. Or they leave an armored personnel carrier right near the bottom of the wire, and we can get in there and drive through a breakaway section of the fence and drive away until we get to a helicopter pickup point. So we all have to practice learning how to drive a tank, and that was pretty fun. Because everyone's trying to outdo the others, and they finally had to clamp down when one of the astronauts actually got the thing stuck in a sand dune, and they had to pull it out. And they teach us about fighting fires because, again, there's a lot of hazardous material there. You have to learn also about how to put on gas masks and the like. But if there is a fire, proper application of a spray can actually make a path through it, and that might save your life. So, it is a lot of fun, I have to admit, but it definitely brings back to you the realization that there's a lot of dangerous stuff going on here involved with the launch. So again, you're living with this risk, and everybody in their own personal way has to learn how to deal with it. So after the test countdown, back to Houston for 3 more weeks, doing our final integrated simulations with mission control. Then we fly back again. At this point, you can see we're sort of alone because we're in medical quarantine. They want to isolate us from potential common cold germs. So some people can come and visit us, family members, no children under 18 because there's a lot of germs going around in schools, and you have to get checked out by the doctors. They look at your throat and take your temperature. And at that point, things are getting close. Well, you hope they are. Of course, there's launch delays, and that's another part of being an astronaut. For my second flight, we went down for our first launch attempt in May of 1990, and there were hydrogen leaks and you don't find this out until about 4 hours before the launch time when they're doing the final fill. And I won't tell you the whole story, but we went down 5 times before we were finally launched on the 2nd of December of that year. So when people ask about the psychological characteristics that you need to be an astronaut, I think a lot of people are thinking about, courage under stress and the like, but patience I put right near the top. So we do have at our disposal the famous beach house, which is a nice place to you can go and be away from everything. And, as the time gets close, everybody has their own thoughts, and I always enjoyed either walking or riding a bicycle along the beach and just kind of relaxing. At this point, you've done all the training that you're going to do. The night before launch, they light up the shuttle on the launch pad, and it's really quite beautiful, and we all go out there, and that's the night viewing. Get up in the morning and have breakfast. Now, back in the days when men were men, at the beginning of the space program, it was steak and eggs, right? But as we learned more about the risk of space motion sickness, and I tended to have just a lightly buttered bagel for breakfast and a cup of tea and keep the stomach rather empty, although as it turned out I never had trouble with that, but that's the way I dealt with that aspect of the risk. Anyway, get in the launch and entry suits. This is actually a pressure suit underneath that, and then the orange material is fire retardant and gives you certain protection against hazardous chemicals. Out to the launch pad, into the Astrovan. This is not the time when you want to be asking yourself, do I really want to do this? Because I remember my feelings when I went out for my first flight. I had dreamed of going into space probably ever since I was 6 years old, and I thought, it's really going to happen. I gave you a good idea of the intensity of the training that we go through. So in terms of how I personally dealt with the risk, I had full confidence that if anything happened that we could do something about, we were well enough trained as a crew that we could take whatever steps were necessary. And if something happens that we couldn't do anything about, and there's lots of things that can happen that you can't do anything about, what's the point of worrying about it? Now, that's a very rational way of looking at things, and fear is not rational. You will find some astronauts who will tell you that they don't like launches because of the risk involved. For me, I figured, I've dreamed of doing this since I was 6 years old. I'm going to sit back and enjoy the flight because it is quite an experience, as we'll go into in a minute. The difference today, though, when you go up on the launch pad is the tank is full of cryogenic propellants, so all the metal has shrunk and it's creaking because of everything kind of adjusting to the new temperatures, and the pad is empty, except we go in, we take an elevator up, we go in through the white room here, which hooks up to the hatch of the shuttle, and there's only about a half a dozen people up there who help us get in our final parachute harness and strap us into the seats, close the hatch, and then they evacuate, and basically you are all alone sitting up on the launch pad, and we gradually count down until and you start feeling the vibrations as the main engines start. The whole shuttle tilts forward and comes back, and then 6 seconds later you get a big kick in the pants and everything starts shaking. I mean, it's hard to describe the vibration. One of my astronaut colleagues said, well, imagine that you are driving an old pickup truck with no shock absorbers down a railroad track going over the railroad ties. It's shaking, it's very noisy. Of course, we have helmets on with full visors, otherwise we wouldn't be able to hear, we'd be deafened, basically. Most of the vibration is coming from the solids because there's a lot of turbulence inside the solid motors, and that's what's shaking us around. We call this riding the fire. I think you get a sense of why. But if you think there's a lot of vibration when you leave the ground, that's nothing compared to when you go through Mach 1. And of course, you break the sound barrier going straight up. That's how much power you have. You heard talk about the thrust of a rocket engine. Well, our thrust to weight ratio is quite a bit greater than 1, and so we're accelerating with about half a G when we start out. And when you go through Mach 1, the vibration gets even more intense. For my first flight, when I didn't really know what to expect, the vibration got so intense, I thought something must be wrong. The wings are going to come off or something. And actually, if you look at slow motion photos of the shuttle as it was going up, you could actually see the wings vibrating back and forth, and the tail was shaking. Again, the people who designed it knew what they were doing, and it does hold together. And then after 2 minutes, the solids have burned all their fuel. They come off, and already you're in space. You're only about 30 kilometers above the ground, but basically you're above the blue atmosphere, and you look out the windows and everything is black. And at this point, it gets pretty smooth for the shuttle. The liquid engines burn for another 6.5, 6 3/4 minutes, depending on how high you want to go. And then all of a sudden, it gets very quiet, and the shuttle built up only to about 3 Gs, which any healthy person can take 3 Gs. It's not particularly comfortable. You're pushed back in your seat. Your helmet now, instead of weighing 15 pounds, weighs 45 pounds, so you can't really move your head around unless you really move it with your hands. But as I say, you can tolerate that. Some other rockets pull more Gs than that. But in all cases, it's that magical moment when the engines cut down and you feel yourself floating out of your seat. And of course, I had done many, many parabolic flights, and the thing that you get so used to when you're doing parabolic flights is you better be either back in your seat or sitting on the ground when you pull out after 20 seconds, because you don't want to be floating up in the ceiling and then all of a sudden whammo, as you pull 2 Gs. So I felt myself sort of floating around, and after about a minute, I realized I was waiting for the pullout. And that's when it really hit me. No pullout this time. You're in space. And, then the next thing I knew, there was this big bang, bang as we flew off the external tank. And I looked out the window, and we were approaching the coast of Africa. I hope all of you recognize the Straits of Gibraltar. There's Africa and Europe. From an airplane, you look out and you see entire cities spread out beneath you. From an orbiting spacecraft, you can see entire continents. And that's the incredible difference in perspective that you get from space. Now, of course, the few astronauts who went to the moon had an even farther perspective of the Earth. But, you see the curvature of the planet. You see this very thin blue line, which is all that we see of our atmosphere when you're up there. You go out on a beautiful day like today and you look at the big blue sky. I mean, it's almost a cliche in the English language, but it's not really so big when you look at it from a cosmic perspective. And it's just that very thin layer of atmosphere that's protecting us. This is one of the first realizations that you get when you're up there in your spaceship and you look out the window and you realize it's a vacuum out there. I wouldn't last for 10 seconds if it weren't for my protective spacecraft around me and the environment that it's creating. And it's that atmosphere that's creating that environment for us here on Earth. I love the mountains, and so I took lots of pictures of the Andes, and in this case the Himalayas with the Tibetan highlands and the Indian subcontinent. And of course, the reason we can stay in orbit, you understand the orbital mechanics, is because we're going really fast. We're going around the world every 90 minutes, so that means about 5 miles or 8 kilometers every second. So people ask, well, do you have a sense of how fast you're going? Man, that's really fast. The problem is there's no vibration. How do you, when you're in a car and you're going fast? Well, you have the road noise and vibrations and wind, or in an airplane you can hear the engines rumbling and you can hear the wind outside your window. Well, up in space, I mean, there's no wind, there's no vibration, there's no trees going by you to judge the speed. So all you can do is, you look out the window and there's San Francisco Bay and the Golden Gate Bridge, and then 10 minutes later you're flying over Cape Cod. And so intellectually you're going fast. And of course the sun is rising and setting every 90 minutes. So you don't live your life by the sun anymore. You live your life by the clock on the wall, which keeps what we call mission elapsed time, and that's how we know what we're supposed to do when. That's kind of what it looks like. People always want to know, what does it feel like to be in space? And that's a much harder thing to share, but I'll try. So the very first feeling you get when you become weightless, and some of you who have flown in parabolic planes may have experienced this, you almost feel like you're upside down because you feel this blood rushing to your head, because our bodies have evolved in 1G. We have a system, you'll hear about this in some of the life science talks you get. We have a system of valves in our legs to help pump the blood back up to our upper body so that your blood doesn't all pool down in your toes. And that system keeps on working even when gravity, because you're in orbit, you're now weightless, you're in free fall. It's not being pulled down anymore because the blood is floating just like the rest of your body. And so there's this rush of fluid to your upper body, and that has many physiological consequences. The other thing, of course, is that you see my eyes are closed here. How do we actually know which way is up and which way is down? Well, on the Earth, we have our eyes, of course, and they still work in space. I feel pressure on the balls of my feet, so I know that I'm standing on something, but when you're floating, you don't get that feedback. And the vestibular organs in your inner ear, and again, you'll hear more about the details of this in your life sciences lectures, but they depend on gravity. They measure acceleration, and gravity is an acceleration. That shuts down. So with my eyes closed, I can be upside down, I can be right side up. There is no upside down or right side up. And this can cause a lot of confusion. Maybe some of you have experienced motion sickness in an airplane or seasickness. If you're sitting in the cabin of a boat and the boat is rocking back and forth, and your inner ear will tell you that you're moving back and forth, but your eyes, if you're sitting in the cabin, they don't see anything moving, and you get this sensory conflict, which we think is responsible for motion sickness. It's not quite, I've never heard a really thorough explanation of the etiology, but in space it's kind of just the opposite, because your eyes are telling you you're moving around, so your eyes are telling you that you're moving, but your inner ear doesn't know up or down, and so you still have this sensory conflict. So roughly about 2/3 of the people who go into space, certainly for the first time, experience some form of what we call space motion sickness. In the early days of shuttle flights, this was considered a very serious medical problem, but we have pretty good drugs to, anti-motion sickness drugs, and it's not really something that too many people worry about anymore, although, as I say, I never did eat a big breakfast, even though I didn't suffer from it for future flights. I always had a small breakfast before going up. There's many strange things that occur to your perception of up and down. For instance, when you are outside in a spacewalk on the shuttle, we have these handholds you can see, and it's very convenient to move around with your feet pointed directly away from the shuttle, because you can see you have a clear view from your eyes of what's ahead of you. And so the shuttle, of course, is much more massive than you are, and so you tend to just regard the shuttle as being down, because that's your point of orientation. So you have this feeling that you're sort of standing on your hands, moving up and down, and it seems very natural. But every once in a while, and I have to say this has never happened to me on my spacewalks, but other people have reported that you can all of a sudden get this sensory flip, so that all of a sudden you're now hanging on for dear life, and there's the Earth a few hundred kilometers below you, and you just don't want to let go. And this sense of vertigo, as I say, it has affected a fair number of people out on spacewalks, more so even on the International Space Station, which is a lot bigger than the shuttle. Many other things happen physiologically with the combination of the fluid shift, which tends to fill up the discs in your vertebral column, and also the gravity is not pulling down on you. I'm being measured here by my crewmate about an hour or two after getting into orbit, and I'm 6'2", that's 188 centimeters on the ground. Here I measured out at about 6'4", 193 centimeters. So there are, if some of you have visited some castles over in Europe, down in the dungeons, they have these machines which can actually make you grow by a few inches, and it is never considered a particularly pleasant experience. And in fact, during the first few days of spaceflight, there's a lot of headaches because of the fluid shift. What happens, of course, is that your body senses that you have too much fluid, so over the first few days in space, you actually urinate a lot. You tend to lose about a liter and a half of fluid, and then you reach a space equilibrium and you no longer have this headache, although you still have more fluid in your head than you normally do. which actually tends to get rid of your wrinkles a lot better than Botox. Other physiological things, particularly I've been told by some of my women astronaut colleagues that things don't sag in space, so you can think about that. Anyway, and then there's lower back pain from this growth, and so there is a fair amount of aspirin and Motrin which get popped during the first few days of spaceflight. But humans, both psychologically and physiologically, we're pretty adaptable, and so after a few days, almost everybody is having a great time. I mean, I told you the other day when I was talking about weightlessness, it's really fun. Let me talk a little bit about living on board. Everybody asks about food. This is a lot of people's conception of astronaut food, and this is what they ate 40 years ago on Mercury and Gemini. But things have gotten a lot better. We have meals ready to eat, which is actually real food. And just on my final flight, I thought we would set up as much of a gourmet dinner as we possibly could. So we had actually MRE steak and asparagus, potatoes au gratin, Costa Rican coffee, Italian Parmesan cheese, freeze-dried espresso. I just read the Lavazza is making a real espresso machine now for space, although you're still going to have to drink it out of a straw, so you can't really get the full aroma of it unless maybe you could put it into some sort of a semi-permeable membrane where the aroma would come out where the liquid wouldn't. The one thing that's truly different, of course, is the seating arrangements, which there's all sorts of ways of using volume. And people ask, doesn't it get really crowded, particularly in the shuttle? There's a lot more room in the space station. But the nice thing is that you can use the volume inside the shuttle or any small spacecraft much more efficiently than if everybody has to stand on the ground, as you can see. And then the other inevitable question is, so just very briefly, there's the tube for liquid waste, and there's a fan which causes airflow, and that replaces gravity. For solid waste, inside the hole there's a lot of little holes which blow air, so you sort of have to get used to having air blowing. It's a little bit like, up in the mountains if the wind is blowing and so on. And then the other thing is you have these thigh pads which are on springs, so when you get in there you have to put them on your thigh to hold yourself down so you make a good suction. You can imagine if you start floating up in the middle. Enough said. Okay, we'll go on. Sleeping arrangements, if everybody sleeps at the same time, on the shuttle we used to just use sleeping bags, and you could some people didn't feel comfortable floating while they were. I loved it. I would loosely tie off the front and back of my sleeping bag so that I didn't float against the wall or against somebody else. But many people didn't feel comfortable, and they literally have bungee cords to hold them and press them against the wall so that they get the feeling that there's pressure on their back, which then makes them comfortable and they can go to sleep. And sleeping, it's a very personal thing. So that's a little bit about living on board. The whole psychology, though, of what it's like being up there. These incredible views. These are all the different layers of the troposphere and the stratosphere going up to the ionosphere, the moon and Jupiter. As I said, I love the mountains, and I often see analogies between mountaineering and going into space in the sense that there's a certain danger involved to get up to the high ground. There's a lot of training involved. But then once you get up there, you have a sense of isolation. The world is spread out below you. Somehow it brings a sort of clarity of mind as well of vision. And space is higher than the highest mountaintop, so this feeling is intensified. And then some things which you just never experience on the ground. I want you to take a look at the sun here, and never mind the rays coming out. That's an artifact of the camera. But you're seeing the sun in a black sky. That's how we see stars at night, but you've never seen the sun in a black sky because we're underneath our atmosphere. So it's a new world out there. The sense of what it's like being weightless, the freedom of not having weight in your body, is almost impossible to share because language is based on shared experience, and we don't share that experience. So we try to take pictures mainly to share at least what the sorts of things you can do. One of my crewmates was an amateur juggler. So he said, since time immemorial, the dream of a juggler was to make it appear as though the balls could float motionless in the air. Well, you know what? You can do it in space. And my magic flying carpet here is not a Photoshop. It's the real thing. There are just these magic moments where this was on this is the Hubble Space Telescope up 600 kilometers above the ground, and just Story and me floating up there, suspended between heaven and earth. These are moments which we carry for the rest of our lives. I don't imagine I'll ever be up there again, but something I'll never forget. Of course, we're not flying the shuttle anymore, so crews are now up in the International Space Station. I'm just very briefly going to show you one of the many films that have been made. I'm only going to show it briefly because you can download these. Maybe some of you have already seen it, but just being able to look at the Earth moving underneath you. And of course, this is going much, much faster than real time. The most spectacular time is in some ways at night, because you can actually see human civilization spread out, the city lights. During the day, you only really can make out cities when you're right above them because they don't have that much contrast with the surrounding land. And when they get out towards the horizon, everything sort of blends together. But the lights of cities at night, you can see all the way out to the horizon. And you never got tired of looking. People would ask me, what did I do in my free time? Just look out the window. Never got tired of it. So as I say, these are on the web. If you haven't seen them before, download them, enjoy them. It's really an extraordinary perspective. But at least for the time being, when you go up into space, eventually you want to come home. And so at the end of the mission, we turn our spacecraft backwards, essentially, fire our rockets to slow down just a little bit, just so that we take our circular orbit and make it slightly elliptical with the perigee now just intersecting the Earth's atmosphere. And that, of course, slows us down by friction, which it's a spectacular ride down, whether you're in a shuttle or a space capsule. This is a picture taken from Houston as the shuttle was flying over on its way to a landing at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And I mean, it's a meteorite, basically. We're surrounded by several thousand degree plasma. This is a truly spectacular picture taken of the shuttle reentry from the space station. The other thing you can see, which is one of the things I never got tired of looking at, the Earth at night is surrounded by a halo. It's about 100 kilometers above the ground. Oxygen and nitrogen atoms get excited by the sun's ultraviolet radiation, and then they re-emit the radiation, and you can see it at night. Here it looks green, sometimes it looks orange, sometimes it looks brownish, sometimes there's a double layer. It interacts with the aurora. I never got tired of looking at that. And inside, you look out and first you see a dull reddish glow, and then it gets kind of orange, and then yellow, and then bright white. And the most spectacular thing during my shuttle reentries, looking out the rear window, a motorboat leaves a wake in the water. Well, this is the wake in a plasma wake trailing a space shuttle. And these little colored lines here, they're all shimmering, it's moving around. Between each of the tiles on the shuttle, there are little separators, little pieces of material, and every once in a while, a little bit of those break off, and so I would be looking out the window, and of course, as soon as they break off, they vaporize, and you get a huge bright going by, and a minute later, and I would always think, God, I hope that's nothing important. And the other thing that happens, and in a way it's kind of sad because you feel your weight coming back as you're decelerating. And so what I would often do, I'd take a pencil or a marking pen and just put it in front of me. And of course, you're used to it just floating. But now all of a sudden, very slowly, it starts to move down, and then I take it up, and now it's moving down a little faster. And then I reach over to get my camera to take a picture, and oh, what's this? It doesn't want to move because I'm used to it just floating. And I have to say, there's a certain sadness involved because I hope you've gotten the sense from what I've said of how wondrous that feeling of weightlessness is. And of course, nowadays, this is how they land. A big boom with retro rockets, and it can be in the deserts of Kazakhstan or in the middle of a frozen taiga. So that's why they have to do all of these survival things. So I have to say, I think the shuttle was a much more civilized way to come home, and a little bit like landing in the airplane. I do remember on my very first flight. That was before we had active nose wheel steering and the drag chutes, and the only way you could steer was by differential braking on the rears, and we also didn't have the new carbon-carbon brakes. And so I told you on my first flight we did this contingency spacewalk, and we did an unplanned rendezvous with the satellite. It was a wild flight, and I remember my feeling as we came down on the runway, and I could feel us decelerating. We were just about coming to a stop, and I remember thinking, well, that's the end of an incredible mission. Nothing can go wrong now. And then everything shook, and I thought, well, what happened was one of our tires blew. That's the only time that ever happened in the shuttle, and happened to me. So they've made a lot of improvements, and of course. Then you get out. This was in the early days before we were wearing the orange suits, and you're a little bit unsteady because your brain, your inner ears have gotten used to being without gravity. And again, there's an illusion which you'll hear about hopefully in the life science lecture called tilt translation. When you move this, I discovered this by accident. Nobody had warned me. I think they warn people in advance now. But you move, I was sitting in the seat, taking my helmet off after landing, and I was moving my head around, and all of a sudden, it felt like my head was a tennis ball bouncing from one wall to the other, just moving a little bit. So when the astronauts get outside and we like to walk around and sort of, you really, I never could quite understand how we had formed in that short time. You really form a bond with your spacecraft, with your shuttle. You get on the ground and you look up and you realize, that's the machine which kept us alive and allowed us to do these incredible things. And the shuttle really has given us a mastery of operations in low Earth orbit. But when you're walking around, you will see people, their legs are pretty wide apart, and when you go around a corner, you're a little bit unsteady. I remember going to the astronaut crew quarters, because you're pretty sweaty inside these suits when after the stress of reentry. There's a big sign in the shower room saying, "Do not shower alone." You can imagine all the jokes that came from that. And then there's just a few other things, getting used to. When you eat up there. For instance, I don't have a knife or fork with me, but I want something to drink. Okay, so I'm not going to drop this, by the way. Don't worry. But what happened was, you're eating out of your food pack, and you want to get a drink, so you don't have to put your knife or fork down. You just sort of let go of it, and it floats there, and you reach over, you have your drink, and then you grab your fork and you continue to eat. So I sat down for my first meal after coming back. You can guess what's happening, and I'm eating my salad because one of the things that you don't get up there is crunchy stuff, so I really craved a salad. And of course I reached for my water, and my wife laughed at me. I never made the mistake again, but there's a lot of getting used to. And of course your sense of balance doesn't come back right away. After a 2-week shuttle flight, I felt by about day 3, well, on the second day I could ride a bicycle, and by day 3 I was pretty much felt normal. Coming back from 6 months on the space station, it takes longer, and some people can take even a couple of weeks before they feel completely normal. And I just want to finish maybe trying to answer a question that I often get asked, and that is, after it's all over, has spaceflight changed you somehow? And it's a very, very difficult thing to answer. There's no question spaceflight is a peak experience. There's many other types of peak experiences. How does winning an Olympic gold medal change you, and what do you do afterwards? Or the first time you hear an incredibly beautiful piece of music, that changes you. It's not easy to describe how it changes you, but it does. So I'll just leave you with a poem. It's actually a poem written about mountaineering that my brother gave to me before my first flight, and I read it to my crew just before reentry. And it, I think, captures maybe some of the best I can do to try to answer it. It was from it's originally in French by a surrealist poet from the early 20th century, René Daumal. The book is called Le Mont Analogue, or Mount Analog, and it's about a mountaineering expedition to an imaginary mountain. And in part of it, he says the following: you cannot stay on the summit forever. You have to descend. So why bother in the first place? Well, just this: what is above knows what was below, but what has remained below does not know what was above. You climb and you see. You descend and you see no more, but you have seen. There's an art to conducting yourself in the lower regions by the memory of what you experienced higher up. When you can no longer see, at least you can still know. And that's the best I can do to describe what was truly an extraordinary opportunity that I had to go into space 5 times. And of course, as I told you before, NASA didn't send us up to do just so we can have these transcendental experiences. We did a lot of useful work when we were up there, but the experience, the personal experience, is there nonetheless. Something that will be with me for all my life, and I always enjoy the opportunity to share it, particularly with people like you who care about this experience and are curious about it. So I hope I've answered maybe some of the questions that you've had about what it's like flying in space. And I know we'll have some time for questions, but it's really been a pleasure being with you this week. I'll be here tomorrow as well. Then I have to go back to my day job, but I certainly wish you all well for the rest of the summer, and it's been great getting to know at least some of you. So, thanks. So there is going to be a reception afterwards, and we'll have a little time to chat there. But we have some time for a few questions, I think, while we're still here in the hall. And John will let us know when we have to finish up. So just speak up loud. I don't think we have microphones going around, but yes, I'll repeat the questions.
There's one here.
Oh, we microphone. Do? Okay.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for your presentation. You flew in what were probably cleaner skies and orbits. Now that the space debris have numbers has increased, would it be on the back of your mind now if you were to do spacewalk, or was it in your mind as well?
That's one of those things where if there's a piece of space debris that has my number on it, there's nothing I can do about it. I know that if I get a small hole in my suit, I have enough emergency oxygen to feed that leak for a half hour, let me get back inside. And as I say, but that's my personality, okay? And if you tend to worry about things like this excessively, then maybe you're in the wrong line of business. That's the best I can say. Mm-hmm.
May I ask you what happened when you were 6 that made you want to go to space?
What happened when I was 6 years old that got me interested in space? Well, I grew up in New York City, and my father used to take me to the Hayden Planetarium. And I mean, they took me to a lot of other things too. They took me to orchestra concerts, and I love music, but I never really desired to be a professional musician. And I went to art museums, and I like art, but I never really had a desire to be a painting. So why it was that somehow space got to me, it's kind of hard to say, but you know, they saw that it did, and I also was very fortunate then to have a third grade teacher who saw that I was, because I always used to doodle and draw pictures of rocket ships in class, and she saw that, and so she encouraged me, and you know, that was also back in that was before Sputnik even. I mean, I'm old enough that I remember that, and there was a lot that a young kid could read about space. If they were in magazines, there were television programs, you know, Wernher von Braun and Willy Ley talking about their visions of the future of the space age. And it was an exciting time, and it kind of represented the future. Although, as I think I mentioned a couple of days ago, I didn't, although it was a great dream, all the early astronauts were military test pilots, and so I never really thought that was going to be something that I'd be able to do until the shuttle came along.
Hello, Jeff here. Yeah, I know, I mean, you told there were many beautiful pictures and the scenes which you saw, but if there is one postcard, if you want to take from space, one picture that you love the most, which would be that? Is it the...
No, wait a minute. That wasn't supposed to end. It was that one that I just showed you.
The Himalayan?
Yeah. That's, okay. Where's my pointer? Oh, yeah, I put it away. Yeah, because and let me go back to presenter mode here. Yeah, so that's me with the red stripe. I was free floating that day. Of course, we're attached to the arms by a thin stainless steel cable so that we don't float away. I'm enough of a physicist that I understand that I'm in orbit just like the shuttle is. And when I look at this, it brings back to me the moments when every once in a while I just let go. And it was psychologically transformative. When you're holding on, it was like the picture I showed before of walking on your hands. As long as you're holding on to the shuttle is so much more massive. You know, you push against it and you're part of the whole shuttle system. As soon as I let go, there was this psychological transformation that I was a free-floating satellite. And it was particularly wondrous at night. Occasionally I would let go and sort of turn around so that I couldn't see the shuttle. It was behind me. And so there I was, you know, just sort of lost in space. And this picture always kind of brings that back to me. So that's my postcard.
Using your experiences in orbit and viewing the Earth, can you comment on what you think will happen with commercial tourism where more and more people get to experience the same thing?
Well, I don't know if they're going to experience this as tourists, but just that wondrous feeling of weightlessness. I mean, even people already who have gone commercially on the zero gravity, the zero G plane, they love it. And of the few billionaires who have been able to go up to the space station, I think I mentioned Charles Simeone. He loved it so much he went a second time. He's got the money, he can afford it. So what I hope is that more and more people will talk about space and the experience, and maybe it will raise public consciousness of space. What that might do in the long run for public support of space flight is hard to say, but I think it can only do good for the idea of getting humanity into being a species which doesn't just have to be glued to the surface of the Earth. That's what I hope will happen, but we'll see.
When you're landing, I don't know the exact speeds, but I guess it's like, I don't know.
About 200 knots.
I don't know, how much is a knot?
About 300 kilometers an hour.
Oh, okay. So it just gets much slower when you're descending.
Oh yeah, that's the whole idea. You have to slow down from 8 kilometers a second to 300 kilometers an hour so that you can land on the runway. And of course, if you're going to touch down on the ground, you better be going a lot slower than that. You don't want to hit the ground vertically going at 300 kilometers an hour.
So you did that actively, or does just the drag slow you down?
No, it's the drag. The atmospheric drag is what slows you down, absolutely. Yeah. And you can really feel the deceleration. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What are the preconditional checks will be made before you board the shuttle?
What kind of tests?
From the launch vehicle side, what kind of its checkpoints will be checked before astronauts are allowed to go aboard the space shuttle?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean in terms of checking our health.
That is my second part. For the
there's a lot of measurements that they do on us, because one of the critical things that the flight surgeons and the medical researchers want to find out is what is the effect of weightlessness on the human body. With the shuttle, we could study that. What we were mostly concentrating on was the initial period of adaptation to space. So a lot of tests. They would measure eye movements. They measure muscular coordination. They attach you to bungee cords and drop you to sense some of your reflexes. On some of the Space Lab flights, they actually had sleds which moved back and forth to create planned acceleration that they could measure. So lots and lots and lots of tests that were done.
No, on the day of launch, what time will be boarding on the space shuttle? What will be the condition of the launch vehicle at that point of time?
We have a thorough medical checkup 10 days before launch, and the only thing they really do on launch day is to make sure that they basically ask us if we feel okay. And there have been one or two flights which had to be postponed because the crew, at least somebody on the crew, actually had gotten a cold despite the medical quarantine. But once you're inside 10 days, you're pretty much, the doctors leave you alone.
My first question is kind of odd, but do you remember anything you were doing with your hands while you were going up in the space shuttle?
Yeah, I was holding on, thinking, I hope this thing holds together.
And my second question is, what was the funniest thing that anybody's ever done around you in space?
Oh, golly. The funniest thing. I have to say, on my shorter space shuttle flights, we weren't. I mean, there were lots of jokes, little sort of jokes among the crew, and some crews were funnier than others. I've found from looking at life that the astronauts these days live on the International Space Station. People go much more out of their way to provide, kind of comic relief and recreation. We do. We take a lot of written material with us. It's called the flight data file. Nowadays, it's all on computers. But we had a stack of procedures books this high, and they always had what was called a special flight data file. And this is something where either your trainers or some of your friends in the astronaut office could put in, special pictures or things. And so, we got some cartoons and funny pictures. But I was always just so in awe of what was happening that I didn't really feel the need for humor so much. But that was my personal thing. And as I say, some crews joked around more than other crews. Got two more.
I want to come back to this picture. What if this red strip on your leg would have broke?
Why do we have it?
No. Imagine that this red strip here over there, for some reason would have break. What should have been?
Well, I have one on my other leg, and I have a red stripe up here. That's called redundancy.
All of them break, and you start to fly away.
You're talking. That's not. You mean the strip that's holding us on? Yeah. If that's a very good question. We have there's a policy for what we call hazards, space hazards. If there's a critical hazard, we want to have two independent ways of controlling that hazard. And certainly floating away from your spacecraft, I think, constitutes a real hazard. So the two independent ways we have controlling it are, number one, we have the stainless steel wire. And if for some reason that should either break or you don't put it on properly and it comes loose, with the space shuttle could come and get us. I mean, the shuttle could do a rendezvous, and they could do a rendezvous with a floating astronaut just like they could do a rendezvous with the space station or the Hubble telescope. Nowadays, though, when we have astronauts doing spacewalks outside the International Space Station, the space station can't go and do a rendezvous. They can't maneuver it. So nowadays, the second backup after your wire is that you have a jetpack built into your backpack, little rocket jets. You've seen the famous pictures of the astronaut in the manned maneuvering unit back in the early days of the shuttle. We don't use that anymore, but we have, for emergency use only, this rescue system, so that if you fall off and you're floating away from the station, you can stabilize yourself. There's little gyros in it, and turn yourself so you're facing the station, and then fire your jets so you get back. And the astronauts practice that in simulators. So that's what you would do. Now I think we have time for maybe one last question. Who's got the mic?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how is your health right now? I mean, any collateral effects? And another question is, what do you think of the movie Gravity?
Okay, well, Gravity is a nice one to finish with. I'm still, touch wood, as we say. I'm pretty healthy. To my knowledge, no long-term effects of spaceflight, except that my hair fell out, but that's another story. You saw pictures of me in the training there. I really did have hair at one time, and it was much darker. But Gravity was a great movie for the spectacle of how the wondrousness of floating in orbit and looking at the Earth below you. But I think maybe one good quiz for you on a weekend would be for you all to, now that you've learned something about orbital mechanics, to explain why it is that you cannot fly with a little jetpack from the Hubble Space Telescope in a 28-degree inclination orbit to the International Space Station, which is in a 51-degree inclination orbit. And I didn't really have an opportunity in my week here to talk to you in detail about doing a spacewalk, but inside a spacesuit, you actually wear 2 layers of thermal underwear, one to keep you warm and one to keep you cool, and you have gloves on and little booties and a communications helmet. Whereas when Sandra Bullock came out of her spacesuit, she was just wearing a skimpy t-shirt and bikini shorts, but as they say, it's a movie. And you know, I think it's, if movies can get people thinking not only about how wonderful it is being in space, but the idea that space debris is a serious problem, you know, maybe that's good. Although I have to say, there was that beautiful scene in Gravity where you get this big cloud of space debris slowly moving over the horizon, approaching you, and it was very photogenic in the movie. But in reality, if something is going to hit you, you'd never see it coming because it's moving at orbital velocity of 8 kilometers a second. So that's a good one to end on, and let's all go up and have some refreshments, and we can continue to talk up there.